If you have driven around the Mountain West, there's a good chance you've happened upon old mining sites, from small abandoned prospect shafts to fully developed mining operations now covered in warning signs. Or perhaps even historic sites that preserve surrounding mining towns and buildings. But even when signage alerts you to the complicated histories of racial strife, labor movements, or even violence, they don't really capture just how fraught and complex life at these spaces could be. In her new book, A Workplace of Their Own, Rockefeller, Roach, and the Labor's Battle Over Industrial Democracy, historian María Montoya investigates struggles over who controlled mining workplaces by inviting us into intimate proximity to miners and their families' experiences, as well as those of the mine operators and owners. The interwoven bottom-up and top-down approaches paint fascinating pictures that connect national movements and figures to these local Western stories. Thanks for listening. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with authors from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. It is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, am Associate Director and a Professor of History. My goal as host is for these conversations to spark your curiosity about and interest in thinking more deeply about the region's lands, cultures, and peoples in the past and present. This is a one-man operation, with me serving as host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am trying to make up for that with my passion about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more about it and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using, write a review, follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information on my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. And with that, let me introduce who we're talking to this month and why. María Montoya is Professor of History at New York University and Global Network Professor at NYU Shanghai, where she recently served as the Dean of Arts and Sciences. She holds a bachelor's, master's, and PhD in history from Yale University, and prior to her 2006 faculty appointment at NYU, held faculty positions at the University of Colorado, Michigan State University, and the University of Michigan. Montoya is an award-winning scholar and has held numerous significant positions in the fields of Western and broader American history, including serving on the Journal of American History's Board of Editors and recently serving as the president of the Western History Association. In addition to countless articles, she is author of Translating Property, the Maxwell Land Grant, and the Conflict Over Land in the American West, 1840 to 1920, which was published by the University of California Press in 2002 and re-released in a paperback edition by the University of Kansas Press in 2005. She is also lead author of the second edition of the textbook Global Americans, A History of the United States, published by Cengage Learning in 2024. In her new book that we discussed today, published by Oxford University Press in 2026, A Workplace of Their Own, Rockefeller, Roach, and the Labor's Battle Over Industrial Democracy, Montoya brings us to familiar territories of mining labor in Colorado and violent conflicts between labor unions and management, like the 1914 Ludlow Massacre and the 1927 Columbine Mine Massacre. In tracking preceding and resulting developments around these events, Montoya broadly investigates the philosophical question of who owned, literally and figuratively, mining workplaces. She uses the figures of mining company owners John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Josephine Roach to widen the context of Colorado mining labor struggles and reveal how Rockefeller and Roach implemented national and even international ideas about workplace reform and control in these small Western locations. These broader contexts are paired with on-the-ground perspective from miners, their families, and labor organizers. It's a terribly complex scene that shows how even the most local of Western histories are always entangled with something bigger. Montoya's work demonstrates how the West provides endless case studies for understanding the nation and even beyond. María Montoya, welcome to Writing Westward.
Great. Thank you so much for having me this morning.
Our viewers can't see this, but you have a very Western looking background behind you, a lovely looking cabin. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're recording from?
Yeah, I'm at a cabin that we've been coming up to since I was about 4 or 5 years old. So I won't tell you how old I am, but it's a very, very long time that we've had this property, and it's right outside the Wild Basin entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. And as I said, been coming here for about 50, 55 years, and had my kids up here when they were really little. We'd spend our entire summers while we were at Michigan. And this is the place where I have written all of my books over the years. So it's a very special childhood memory place for me, but also a really lovely working spot for me. So it's very, very, very special.
Oh, that's you're living the dream there, having an out of the way, very Western isolated writing retreat place. I love it.
Yeah, and I should also mention that
Uh,
we had resisted getting internet till last year. So it was a great writing spot.
so there's nothing to do but write.
Exactly.
That's probably key. Um, well, this kind of scoops what my first question is generally going to be. You grew up in Colorado. You've already mentioned like this, this cabin you have this long connection with. But your education and a lot of your employment has not been in the West. It's been farther east. And whenever guests have this, a Western childhood, but not Western adulthood, I like to start by asking them when it was that they started thinking about the West as a unique region, kinda thinking critically about it and or viewing themselves as a Westerner.
Oh, that's a great question. So I grew up in Arvada, which is a suburb of Denver. I was born in Albuquerque, and my family moved up to Denver. My dad was working for the Atomic Energy Commission and had a job at Rocky Flats. So up until the time I was 18, I had never. I think the farthest east I've been, we had some cousins who lived in Iowa. And I don't think I thought of myself as a Westerner. I just thought of myself as a person who lived in Colorado. But when I was 18, I was lucky enough to be admitted to Yale and went to college there, and also did my later degrees there also as well. But I very have this very distinct memory. I think it was my freshman year. I took Vince Scully's class, a history of architecture, and I think maybe the second or third slide he showed in that lecture was a picture of Taos Pueblo, which was someplace I had been numerous times as a child, but knew it very, very well. And I think that was the first time it struck me that, oh, the place where we live can be some place that we study, that we try to seek a deeper understanding about. And I was just thrilled that somebody who seemed so, incredible and exotic to me would take an interest in a place like Taos. But then I'd say the second time that it really became clear to me was, I'd taken Howard Lamar's class as an undergraduate, but I took this wonderful seminar with Catherine Morsey, who's now at the University of Arizona, and she taught a class called Making a Home in the American West. And I took that class, and I was completely just brought into the history profession. I don't think I'd ever thought about being a historian before, but I thought, "Oh, the stories that we tell about ourselves and our lives and where we grow up and landscape, those are meaningful." And so I think that that's really the moment that I thought that was I started to see myself as a Westerner in a far off place, and that the West could be some place you could study.
Well, I can see some direct through lines between that seminar and your later work then. So we have Catherine Morsey to blame for your
Absolutely.
career and
Yes.
and everything. Yeah. She must have been a very young professor though, because she's not that much older than you are,
Oh, no,
I
I
don't
think she
think.
was actually maybe a graduate student or a postdoc. She had just finished up, so,
Okay.
we got to be great friends, and, we've been great friends ever since, so I do credit her for my one of my loves of the West.
Oh, that's great. Um, well, you've done a lot of work on labor, gender, the home, like I can probably all those things that you talked about in Morrissey's seminar. So I can see clear connections between most of your past work and your book that we're talking about today, A Workplace of Their Own. Um, A lot of ink has been spilled about mining labor and violence in Colorado. And when I first heard about this book project you were doing, I was immediately curious. As I am, whenever someone's working on a topic that seems like it's already been written about plenty, I'm always curious. Like, so what are the new research questions that this person's bringing, and so they won't just be retreading old ground. And interestingly, you literally open your introduction with research questions. I kind of wish more books would do that. Just put them out front, right? And you're asking, who owned the American workplace in the early 20th century? Was it the capitalists, the shareholders, the workers, and so forth? So here's my question. Sorry, long prologue. Um, I'd like to know how it is that you came to write this book. Did you start with these research questions and then land in the Colorado Mines and Violence as the site to study? Or did you start in the Colorado mining and labor history and then dig around and then these questions materialize as you were digging? Or was it some other process completely?
Yeah, that's a great question. The book started very much as a endnote or a book, sort of a bookend to my first book, Translating Property, which is about the Maxwell Land Grant in northern New Mexico and about Hispano land loss over the course of the late 19th century and into a little bit into the 20th century. And the book ends with this group of Hispanos, Mexican Americans who had been landowners who lost their land basically to the Maxwell Land Grant Company, which was eventually sold. Big portions of that land was sold to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. And I wanted to know what happened to those people. And, I had family who had lived on the former Maxwell Land Grant. And I knew that a lot of them and a lot of their children went on to work in the mines. And so I wanted to, think about what that meant for them. What did it mean to go from being somebody owned property to somebody who didn't own as much property and was suffering this kind of loss. And I also had family, who had worked for CF&I in Pueblo, at the steel mill, and so this was another family story that I was really, interested, in. But when you take a long time to write a book, which I have, lots of scholarship comes around. And of course, Thomas Andrews' book came out, which is just a terrific story about the history of these mines leading up to the Ludlow massacre. There was a wonderful biography that came out about Josephine Roach, who's one of the main characters in this book by Robin Muncie. And so I found myself like, and I actually say this in the introduction, it's like, lots of people have written on this. Why am I doing it this at this juncture? And so for me, the research questions then really began to drive the narrative of the story, and it became a story not about just these Hispanos who are living, in these coal camps, but really the international workforce that was being drawn into the state, Italians, Greeks, from all over the world. And what did it mean for these workers to come together and share an identity? And then part of the book also, a lot of it takes place on the East Coast in New York City and Washington, D.C. And this is a question I've been interested forever. I mean, from people such as Gerald Dash and Richard White, who are always asking about the connections between the West and the East, whether it's through capital markets or politics. And that became a main driving narrative of the story as well.
And that's, yeah, through these characters of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Josephine Roche, these um, mining company owners, that we get that all those East and West dynamics. I was a little surprised because thinking of your previous work, and as you kind of mentioned, like these Hispano laborers, um, I was expecting this book to be entirely just kind of like that bottom up working class like history experience, and the book is full of that. But I was surprised by the prominence of these two owners, kind of this top down approach. But doing it in both directions really opens this topic up, I think, in ways that wouldn't if it was solely focused on the bottom up kind of working class perspective. Because you're really trying to get at the tension between the two. So that was something that was very very eye opening for me. Um, There's a lot of background to unpack, and you've already mentioned some of the authors that we could just point people to save some time, but maybe we should spend a quick moment offering a little bit of background. A lot of this book revolves around these two um, uh, massacres, the Ludlow Massacre in 1914 and the Columbine Massacre in 1927. Um, can you give us like the 30-second thumbnail sketch of what, if that's possible, what, and we're going to get to them, especially Columbine. We'll unpack that a little bit more later. But for people who don't know, they hear, the Ludlow Massacre, the Columbine Mine Massacre. Like briefly, like what were those? What led to them? What was the dynamic that caused these outbursts of violence?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Ludlow because I think that's probably the better known one. And of course, I would point people, absolutely to Thomas Andrews' book Killing for Coal, which I think is, still the best analysis and narrative of what is leading up to this, to this massacre in which 18 women and children are found dead, suffocated inside a dugout under one of their tents after this very vicious firefight breaks out between the miners who've been on strike and been moved out to this tent colony. And they're facing down, probably Pinkerton, Baldwin Felts agents who have been hired directly by CFNI, and also the Colorado State Militia. And it is a tragedy, and I think it's one of the defining moments in not only Western labor history, but U.S. labor history. And it's a moment when Congress and East Coast newspapers are really turning their attention to this kind of industrial violence that's playing out through the West and the kind of instability that it's bringing both politically and economically as the U.S. is kind of beginning to think about heading into World War One. And it's a turning point for somebody both like John D. Rockefeller Jr., who owns CFNI, who's embarrassed by this, is trying to um, sort of make a better name for the Rockefellers. And it's a turning point also for Josephine Roach, who's just sort of coming into this coal market as well. We could talk about her a little bit later on. But
Yeah.
Rockefeller really says, like, this will never happen again. This kind of industrial violence can't happen again. It won't happen under my watch. And so my question was, not even quite 20 years later, 15 years later, there is another mine massacre that occurs farther north, right outside of Denver. What's today is sort of the Erie, Lafayette area. You can't even find them. It's hard to find a marker even for this mine massacre, in which another 5 miners are killed again by the Colorado State Militia over very similar issues that had been boiling up in 1914. And so I really set out to understand what was happening in this period and why this kind of violence could not sort of be stopped and avoided through various mechanisms.
A lot of the work you do is trying to explain that interim between the two and the the activities of Rockefeller and Roach and what they were trying to do to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. And a lot of this is progressive era history. Another thing I wasn't expecting when I walked into this book, but both of them consider themselves in a way progressives. Um, they, this kind of broad set of reform movements of trying to apply new scientific principles or things to better society in various ways, right? Is that maybe that's a really shallow description of progressivism, but there's this broader world, like the temperance movement and labor reform, all these reform movements that are trying to understand how society works or doesn't work, and then tweak things to make it work better. Um, but they come at it from very different ways. Can you give us the kind of basic difference between what Rockefeller tries to do with the Colorado fuel and iron? Is that the I?
Yeah, fuel
Yeah.
and iron. Yeah.
uh, Fuel and Iron, the CFI, through kind of more scientific management versus what Josephine Roach tries to do with a much more labor-friendly approach. How are they in general differing? And then we'll kind of walk through some of the history of these four main ideologies that you talk about for a lot of the book.
So I guess I'll start with Rockefeller, and I think to put Rockefeller and progressive in the same sentence is kind of jarring. It was jarring for me, and I kept kind of resisting this because I think when I went into this project, I had a very clear idea of what I thought the Rockefellers were, and not maybe so much of who John D. Rockefeller himself was. But he was nothing like his father, and there was a reason why John D. Rockefeller Sr. did not turn over, the Standard Oil empire in its entirety to his son. And in fact, the only company that he ever gave any control over to his son was the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. And I speculate that was because there was already kind of an embedded progressive reform that was already going on inside the company, which had been led by an earlier man by the name of John Osgood and Dr. Corwin. For anybody who hangs around in Colorado knows those two names. But they themselves had this very paternalistic notion about how to manage these workers that they were bringing in into these camps, and I think part of that appealed to Rockefeller even from the very, very beginning. But after the massacre, he brings in a scientific management team that's basically led by um, Mackenzie, who goes on later to be the Prime Minister of Canada, who was a big name in reforming labor relations in the 19 teens and the early 1920s. And, I started this project. I end up delving into all of this whole movement of, progressives trying to reform the workplace through somewhat paternalistic ideas of what it meant to manage a workplace, making sure absolutely that there were no unions, that the company knew best about how to manage it, that the workers could have a say in that. But it's very much about Americanization. It's about anti unionism. It's about keeping control. And Rockefeller clearly uses these words in terms of like family dynamics, patriarchy, in the way he's thinking about his relationship to the workers. And in the end, that doesn't work for his workers. His workers are men. They think of themselves as men, and they often see this kind of reform as emasculating towards them. So that's kind of one bucket of progressivism that I call sort of
Huh.
a paternalistic progressivism. The second one is Josephine Roach, and she comes from a completely different background. She actually is a Westerner. She grew up in Nebraska, mostly grew up in Denver. And her father was one of the controlling interests of Rocky Mountain Fuel and Fuel Company, which was the second largest coal company in Colorado and the rival to CF&I. And for some reason, and we don't know why, he leaves all of his shares in the company to Josephine Roach when he passes away in the 1920s. And she eventually gains control of the entire company through a series of financial moves and getting rid of the board and bringing on very labor progressive people into her management team, including John Larson, who had defended the miners back in 1914 at the Ludlow massacre. And she decides to be very pro-union. She is going to recognize the UMW, not the IWW. She wants to give workers a seat at the table. And this is unheard of in the early 1920s. And it infuriates Rockefeller. And so it sets up this kind of ideological battle about how to manage workers. And, I call her sort of a more consumerist approach to how she's managing her workers. She thinks of her workers, but as consumers who have a place in the capitalist society, and she wants to make that as fair as possible. And in the end, I will say both of these financially are both two sort of losing tracks about how to deal with this issue in the 1920s.
Roach is very unique in being so pro-union. Are there also is she the only kind of major female, uh, uh, kind of main, owner or leader of a large mining or, industrial outfit during the time?
From what I know, she is about the only person I can find. I'm just working on another woman right now, Eleanor Boyce, who was married to Ed Boyce, who was a great radical UMW leader in the 1880s and the 1890s. And she ends up owning one of the largest mines in Idaho, the Hercules mine. And so I'm just kind of starting to delve into her and figure out how she was managing her company as well. But certainly nobody was managing the kind of labor, the extensive sort of industrial enterprise in the West as Roach was.
I also was surprised you said of giving Rockefeller the progressive title, but as we'll see, the KKK views themselves in a way as progressive reformers, but it's a complicated, very complicated label. Um,
Progressive could be so many things, right? And so many not those things. It's it's
yeah.
it's very interesting.
Let's maybe now pivot to there's four big ideologies that you refer to throughout the book as a way to understand Rockefeller's and Roach's approach to reforming the workplace, managing labor and tensions and conflicts. And you talk about local producerism, a word that my spell check really doesn't like, business sovereignty, summit arbitration, and maternal protectionism. Those last two kind of being off ramps to the tensions between local producerism and business sovereignty. Um, People who've read a little bit about mining history in general are probably aware of this broad shift from, say, individual hard rock miners are placer mining or just digging their own hole to large scale industrial outfits. Um, and local producerism is kind of at the core of why that transition causes so much tension. Can you explain to us what you mean by this phrase, local producerism?
Yeah, so local producerism for me was a way to organize and think about the kind of work that miners were doing, whether they were hard rock miners, such as that appear in Betsy Jameson's wonderful book, All That Glitters. I mean, that's really what she's talking about when she's talking about those silver and gold miners. And then these early coal miners that come into Colorado about the same time. And although it's very different kind of work, what I point out is that they come to this work with a sense that they could be property owners, whether property owners in those mines or property owners because they make a profit from working in those mines. And it's that kind of individualism, which I think is also gendered, very male in very particular ways, that just does not go away, even as these landscapes become more industrialized because of smelting technology or the kind of capital that's needed to really take out the coal from these southern coal fields. That idea of individualism, of working for yourself, is something that just really butts up against what I call business sovereignty, which we can talk about also.
So, in these individual workers, even if they are now working in a large scale coal mine where they're not just pulling out gold for themselves, they still have this tradition that they're holding to from their own previous mining experience or maybe their father's previous mining experience. This idea of owning the land, owning the resource, and doing with it what you please. That philosophy continues.
Yeah, I think that philosophy continues. It's really about a lot of these workers are new immigrants, right? They're coming from places like Italy, Greece, Southern Europe. They have their own traditions, and I think a lot of what they see when they come to the United States or to the American West is a chance to be property owners and to be holders and to be, really the masters of their own destiny, and they cling to that, whether they're native born or whether they are immigrants. And even in the face of this industrializing landscape and this, massive capital movement into these businesses, they retain that ideology, and they want to retain that ideology, and that constantly puts them up in tension with these large mine owners.
And that explains why so many are attracted to, you know, the what is it, the Western Federation of Mines or Miners, like wealth belongs to the producer, that the ideology, or the Knights of Labor, or which was a little earlier, or the IWW, I think speaks to that maybe lingering desire idea that they were still holding.
Exactly. I think all three of those unions play that ideology towards their miners. And as the AFL becomes more powerful at the end of the 19th century, you're seeing a lot of resistance from the WFM, and the IWW to, giving up those ideas about individualism.
It's also worth mentioning kind of the geography that some of these were very isolated mining communities, and it took a little that set up their own kind of internal systems of how they ran things on their own. And the more isolated they were, the longer it took for the capitalists and these new kind of big industrialized systems to take hold. But they did eventually. So in Colorado, give us some examples of what it is that then emerges and this idea of business sovereignty coming from the management and owner side that then starts to really clash with local producer ideologies.
Well, I think, business sovereignty is the kind of the flip side of this coin, right? So somebody like John Osgood before Rockefeller purchases CF&I and then Rockefeller himself see these enterprises as entirely theirs. They maybe are beholden to shareholders to some extent, but not really. And they run these businesses as the sovereign, or in the case of Rockefeller, as the paternal sovereign, right? He knows best what's for his workers. He knows how to make these communities thrive in ways that he manages particularly. And so you have these two groups who each want control of their workplace to some extent. And I think that's also an issue of respect. A lot of what these miners want within the company union that Rockefeller creates is a sense that they are men, that they are heads of their households, and they should be treated as such and not as sort of wayward children. And so a lot of this is, about economics, it's about wages, it's about safety, but I think also fundamentally it's about how these men are treated as men or perceived by the company as well.
This kind of corporate or magnate paternalism is really complicated because I can imagine from Osgood or Rockefeller's point of view, they're like, well, no, we're applying the best new scientific management principles. And we have sociologists and people thinking about childhood education and health and medicine, culture, religion. Like, we're trying to make your community thrive and we're using all the best new principles to provide everything you need. But that's very top down. So, kind of maybe even going into the home, how did workers' families experience this corporate magnate paternalism that was maybe well intentioned in some ways, but maybe not exactly what they wanted? How did they experience that and view that beyond simply this idea of wanting independence?
Yeah, I think, it's as you said, it's all encompassing, right? So it's not just the workplace. The workplace bleeds out into these camps, which are entirely created by, Rockefeller. They have an industrial design to them. These houses are very particular. They look, very clean. They're brand new. They're, made up in certain ways. There's this wonderful competition that they have in each of the camps. There's more than 20 camps throughout this place. It's called the Better Homes and Gardens competition. And so women would compete to have the best looking house. And you can imagine the best looking house has a white picket fence and a particular kind of garden. Um, and so, but these homes aren't owned by them, right? They rent them and they're completely at the mercy of the company about whether or not they can stay in their home is entirely based on whether their husband is employed by that company and in good standing. Um, so yeah, on one hand, you get all these wonderful things that, miners in other parts of the country, particularly in Pennsylvania or Appalachia, aren't getting. But it comes at a cost, right? It comes at the cost of being constantly monitored, constantly being sort of judged for the kind of house that you keep, for the kind of family that you keep. And I would say that probably one of the biggest sticking points in the camps was, the Rockefellers were Baptists. They were, teetotalers. They were founding members of the WCTU. So there's a kind of Protestant reform that's setting in on these camps. And so many of these immigrants and the local Hispanos are Catholics. They have to leave the camp to go to church. It's very difficult to do that. So that also becomes sort of a flashpoint. So you can see the ways in which this paternalism just seeps down, not only into the workplace, but into their home lives and into their religious lives as well.
Yeah, it's clear where these tensions are going to be coming from every angle. Uh, and one additional factor to kind of pile on and ratchet the tension up that I wasn't as aware of was the open shop movement, these citizen alliances of, local business owners, individuals, organizations that were trying to keep unions out of towns and communities. because there's all these frustrated workers who are starting to welcome those mining labor organizations in, and so that just ratchets things up even further, which as we see at Ludlow, and I mean Ludlow is a part of a broader strike movement in Colorado, but we see these tensions boil over, and in some cases turn to real extreme violence. So you talk about two other ideologies, which I think I mentioned earlier, kind of you present as you actually might even use the word off ramp, but as ways to de escalate, as ways to resolve these disagreements and tensions. And the first few terms summit arbitration. Can you explain to us what you mean by that and how that starts to play out, maybe even before and then after Ludlow?
Yeah. Yeah, so, that is very much a progressive, labor ideology, pushed by somebody like, Teddy Roosevelt, during some of the earlier, coal strikes in which, this benevolent government can come in and step in and, bring both sides to the table, and they can be, thoughtful as they discuss their differences. And there was a real sense that, this was a role that government could play, particularly a progressive, government. And you would bring in, you know, labor economists like Ely and all these people to help resolve these issues, and that all seemed fine. But that means that both sides then have to keep their people in line, and there's also this kind of, I think, regional tension that's going on within the unions themselves, right? The Western Federation of Miners, and often later on the UMW, often thinks that the national management of those unions don't take seriously the problems of Western miners, and they will sell them out for some,
Sure.
bigger sort of national project or national goal that the union might have. And in the same way, federal agents, and federal, progressives can't always keep state militias or state governments in line also as well. So there's this idea of sort of this lofty way of solving these problems that on the ground just does not play out successfully. And so they're not entirely successful. They don't create the kind of off ramp that would prevent the kind of violence that happens in both of these cases.
So the last of the four, can you explain to us what you mean by maternal protectionism and how that maybe how some of these very unique Western women reformers or women involved in these mine movements were trying to de-escalate or resolve some of these tensions?
One of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was to really forefront the role of women in these mining communities. It is no accident that it's women and children who are the victims of the Ludlow massacre. Women were just an integral part of these communities, both to the success of the camps, to the benefit of the company, really, and also to the resistance movement, to the union movement itself. And so there's a couple different kind of maternal reformers that are working in this space. The first, who we often think of as Mother Jones, who's one of the great spokeswomen and ralliers for the Knights of Labor and later for the UMW. And she actually lives in these camps with these families, and rallies men, and has, these very sort of gendered ways in which she speaks to the miners about how they need to be men and stand up for themselves and, do this, to fight the company. But women themselves were often the ones out on the picket lines, and there's all these, stories of like the militia, being more nervous when the women were out there. They could often be more brutal. They were often a little reluctant to engage with the women who had no compunction about throwing rocks at them or charging them or doing this. So there's that kind of reform. But there's also these all sort of like, club women coming out of Denver who want to support these women, much of the same way you would have had like the Mink Brigade supporting, the uprising of 20,000 women in New York City. But as I point out, these women have lots of differences. These miners' wives are ethnic. They're Polish. They're Mexican American. They are European. They're Italian. They're Greek, and they come from a very different perspective than what we think of as sort of these Denver progressive women like Helen Ring Robinson, who have a very particular idea of femininity and motherhood. And so we see a kind of clash here as well. And it's I often and I point out that I think it's this clash that often keeps a lot of these Denver reformers from really embracing the kind of change that needs to happen in these camps to make these women's and these families' lives better.
There are some really unique women, and I may have to revise some of my lectures on progressive era and the formation of, kind of a Victorian middle class, gender roles and so forth, because they are really working outside of some of those broad national middle class maternal roles that are developing in the progressive era,
Right.
and I think in some really, really fascinating ways. So I think I may add a little something
Oh,
to
good.
my lecture next semester about like saying, but this isn't everyone, and here's an interesting example on why. Um, well, these off ramps, these ways to resolve these tensions don't work, as we know. Ludlow and other violent events and strikes and things really plague the region. World War One does some interesting things that I don't know if we don't quite have enough time to get through. But as we move into this era between Ludlow in 1914 and the Columbine mine massacre in 1927, both Rockefeller and Roach, they've gone back east, but they're concerned about kind of cleaning up their image a bit, and they again come to Colorado to implement some more progressive. Man, I keep on using this word progressive. To implement some ideas, Rockefeller through his philanthropic work, Roach via settlement homes, and and other things. They again come back out to Colorado to kind of play, not to play out progressive dreams, but as kind of a laboratory of sorts to work through some of these things. But then moving kind of past that World War One era, I want to talk a little bit about the post-war slump, economic slump, and how that impacts this world, but also increasing racial tensions, the rise of the second Klan, which students are. I always you've used this image in class as well. There's this great image. I think it's from Canyon City, and it's a bunch of the Klan with their hoods on a Ferris wheel
Oh, I've never
in
seen that one, but
1920. Oh,
yeah.
go type in KKK Ferris wheel,
Sure, okay.
and my students. It is the most arresting. Just it's the weirdest picture because you think Klan, and here they are having fun at the fair. And then I tell my students, "Where do you think this is?" And they just list off all these southern locations. I say, "No, this is in Colorado,"
Yeah.
and they're very shocked by that. But also the post World War II rise of like the Red Scare, fears of communism, and foreign anarchists. How does that play out in this world that Rockefeller and Roach are trying to navigate?
Yeah, I have to say, like, the KKK piece kind of really took me by surprise. That was not a path I intended to go down. Um, but the KKK in Colorado is just fascinating. And I cannot give a big enough shout out to Colorado history. The kind of archival work that they've been doing is really incredible. They've got this database called Colorado Historical Newspapers, completely digitized. You can search it. And so that was a great resource for me. The other thing they did was they came across these KKK membership records, and you could actually go onto the History Colorado site, um, and they've geolocated where all these cards, all these people were. And this was a massive, they thought of themselves as a progressive movement. I'm going to talk about why they thought that in a minute. But you cannot underestimate the impact they had in this short period in the early 1920s. They had control of much of the Denver government, big chunks of the Colorado government, and they ran on a ticket of being very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, not so much anti-African American. And I actually have a little vignette in the book about this sort of weird cross between um, where the KKK actually comes to the aid of a African Methodist Episcopalian church who is in need of money. But they see these African American Protestants as very much a bulwark, an American bulwark against these immigrants and these Catholics that they see pouring into Colorado because of these coal mines. Um, so it is flaming a kind of racial tension, but also I would say a religious tension, and an ethnic tension, inside of the state, that, the KKK really picks up on. And at the same time, you're getting a radical labor movement of the IWW moving back into Colorado in 1926, 1927, and all of these sort of come to this head in this clash, at, the 1927 Columbine massacre.
Yeah, these are moments that I think I think national historians, often they ignore the West for all kinds of ways. But man, these are, I feel like Colorado is maybe the key place for understanding the Second Klan. Um, I mean, there and in Oregon, I think
Yeah.
Indiana was pretty big. There are other places where, where they take over local government basically, but not everyone, but a lot of people forget about Colorado, and especially then this conflict between them and the IWW, they both view themselves as reformers,
Right.
but such a clash of ideologies.
Well, it's very difficult for us to think of to even put Klan and progressive in the same sentence, right? Even harder than, Rockefeller and progressivism. But I think until you understand that, you can't understand why the Klan is so widespread in the 1920s, right? They were saying something that was appealing to just your average, you know, native born white family in Denver or Colorado Springs or Canyon City, right? For some reason, it didn't appear radical to join the Klan, and so that image of the Klan on the Ferris wheel, that's what we're really trying to pack and try to understand when we say the Klan was progressive or thought themselves as progressives.
This is the question we don't ask often enough about not just the Klan, but any movement. What was it about their message? Like, why did regular people find it so appealing when we see membership numbers of any organization kind of jump? What does that tell us about the members? I think it tells us a lot about
Yeah.
the fears, the anxieties, what a lot of white Coloradans were concerned about. And by white Coloradans, I mean very kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant
Right.
Coloradans, right? Not thrilled with the Catholics and maybe the Greek Orthodox and
Right.
and others. So Roach is put in a hard position. So she comes back out and she fully takes over the company after the Columbine massacre, and wants to try to resolve this and make sure that things like this never happen again. And you detail the financial ramifications of that, and it's not great. She because she's trying to it's this impossible balance of her desires for positive workplace reform that will make workers happy, but also running a for-profit business.
Right.
And I think we mentioned earlier that one thing she does that was so unheard of, is that she recognizes the United Mine Workers, this union, and makes a contract with them. Um, how does that compare to, say, with what Rockefeller and his industrial relations plan approach? Like, how does this and now bring a real stark contrast to their two approaches?
First of all, I mean, it's just like to just even recognize the union, right, was such a something that had not been happening in Colorado. And of course, Rockefeller thinks, "Oh, I don't need to recognize the union because I've got this company union, the IRP." And and the constant complaint from those men is like, yeah, there's all these material things that we get from it, but we don't get to actually have a say in our workplace, or we don't have a real, working relationship with management. And for her, she's like, I don't want to be in the position of telling you what to do. You put up your union representatives. I'll put up my representatives, and we will talk together. And as I said, her management team had come out of a labor background also as well. So that just seemed to her, I think, cleaner approach. Uh, but she's also trying to stave off the IWW, who are making a big push and claim at this moment. And she is very clear that she will not deal with the IWW. She will only deal with the UMW. And so she herself is sort of walking this tightrope. And what's interesting is, the IWW in their, in their propaganda and in their complaints, says, there's actually no difference between Roach and the UMW, and Rockefeller and the company union. If you really want radical reform, you need to give up on both of those models, and, join the IWW, and take over, the means of production. Again, going back, hearkening back to these ideas of local producerism. So she herself is right, really on this tight line.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way she can please
No.
everyone. And yeah, as we see. Your book then kind of pulls us even farther than I was anticipating into the New Deal era, the Depression and how that hits the Colorado coal economy and its workers, and then Roach's involvement in the New Deal and the FDR administration. I did not know that she was instrumental in the Social Security Act getting passed. She was pushing for universal health care, but
Yeah.
that did not get through. It's kind of a very interesting, not a coda, but an interesting extension of how these things then play out, amidst these intense moments of, World War I and how that turns the economy on its head, and then the Depression, how that again turns things, just disrupts everything. It was a really fascinating way to kind of see these stories play out a little bit further than I was expecting.
Yeah, I think, for me, Roach and the New Deal is for her, she sees that um you can't have the kind of benefits and, proper management of workers um necessarily within a private enterprise. That these questions are much bigger, right? And so, she becomes, one of the most hardcore, New Dealer progressives in thinking about various kinds of social, programs, Social Security, and and really healthcare. And that's her great failure when she can't get healthcare passed right after the Wagner Act. And so that she leaves very disillusioned, thinking that government could really make a big difference here.
But it is so clear, like it's the natural extension. Okay, well, solving this from the business side or the union side didn't work. So who's left? Who's going to solve it? And the government, right?
Right.
Um, but limits there as well. Well, as we like kind of wrap things up, I want to zoom way out, and you position a lot of these histories through Rockefeller and Roach as these individuals bringing outside ideas about labor in the workplace and working class families, and then implementing them in Western settings. Um, and I'm curious if you have any advice or thoughts for Western historians, working in whatever subfields, to think about similar dynamics between the West and broader national or international goings on. Like, how did you approach these West, not West dynamics? And do you have advice for others who maybe want to do the same thing or maybe don't want to but should?
Yeah. I mean, I always think you should be, connecting to these larger things. And I've always, done that in my work. And I think I really learned that from people like Howard Lamar and Bill Cronin, who I studied with. And so, even the earlier book on the Maxwell Land Grant, which seemed to be a story about locals being dispossessed by local politicians. It turns out what was really driving all that was an international market in land and, energy, coming from London markets and markets in the Netherlands, all these people. And I just always think of the West as being, I'm a Westerner, so I think of the West as a center place, but it has all these, massive connections to, national markets, to international labor and immigration. And so I always encourage everybody to always think very broadly when they're writing histories of the West. It's not an isolated place. It's not some place that's out there. I actually think it's a place that's very much in the center, and has these connections through people, through capital, um, in those ways.
Yeah, I think this is a big movement, and a lot of the scholarship of the last couple decades and ongoing is that Western history is never only Western history. It has to be connected to something broader, and lots of historians, as you note, are making those connections a lot better, and it makes the history so much richer.
Right.
Do you want to give us a little sneak peek into what you're working on next? I know there's a
Yeah.
couple books, at least a couple books in the works.
Yeah, I've got a couple little projects that I'm finishing up from this book. There was a whole section of the book that got lopped off in the end, and it picks up this story of healthcare. So I'm just finishing up a piece right now on Henry Kaiser and the founding of Kaiser Permanente in the World War II era. So that's a little piece that kind of ties off that end of the book, and then I'm really done with this. And as I said, I also do this little piece on Ed Boyce on the UMW. Ed Boyce was the most radical of radical WFM leaders in the 1880s. And he ends his life being a hotel owner and one of the richest men in Portland, Oregon in the 1940s and the 1950s. So I'm trying to figure out how that happened.
Unexpected.
Totally unexpected. I'm like really curious about this, and then I found out his wife was this massive mine owner. So that's a little rabbit hole that I'm having fun with this summer. But the two big projects that I'm working on right now is I really want to write a book about a broader history of the Rio Grande and thinking about how this river is formed and forms boundaries and creates all kinds of different economies throughout New Mexico and down into Texas. And so that's a bigger project. But the one that I'm really working on now is a book about the impact of Protestant boarding schools and Protestant missionaries in the late 19th and the 20th century through the 1940s and the 1950s. And my family was converted to Protestantism in the sort of the 1880s in southern Colorado and had a huge impact on my family, sort of where they ended up going and where they went to school and their lives. And so I'm really curious to unpack that story right now. So I'm kind of deep in that.
I think they all sound great. I'll be looking forward to seeing those come out hopefully soon.
Great, thanks.
Maria, thank you so much for spending a little time with us, and congrats on the book. And I hope I'll see you maybe in Portland at the Western soon.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. This was really, really fun, delightful.
All right, we'll see you soon, Maria. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you again for listening. You can find links to our guests' works in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. This podcast isn't monetized, so I'm not chasing subscriber stats for my own gain. But increasing the visibility of the podcast will help promote the works of our excellent guests. So please pause now to subscribe on whatever app you're using and write a review. Follow us on Facebook or Blue Sky and leave comments. And share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, often live streaming them on our YouTube channel. We have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter, reddcenter.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is linked in the show notes. My name is Brendan Rensing, and I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, so you can direct any praise, or more likely critiques, my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and more. My recent titles include a 2018 book, Native But Foreign: Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I recently launched a new series with the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It is a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more, that you can use remotely or on a road trip. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, the Red Center, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind.